There's something universally touching about the moment a child is born. In that first cry, the world pauses, and in the eyes of those who witness it, there's wonder, hope, and a sense of renewal. New life feels sacred. It carries the promise of beginnings, of joy, of endless possibilities. We decorate nurseries, we celebrate birthdays, and we greet every birth as a blessing. And yet, the Buddha, with a gaze unclouded by sentiment, taught something that seems to contradict all of this joy. In his very first teaching, he said plainly, "Birth is suffering." It sounds jarring, almost unthinkable. How could the arrival of life, this miracle we cherish, be categorized as suffering? But the Buddha wasn't dismissing the beauty of life. He wasn't rejecting the tenderness of parents or the marvel of creation. His insight cuts deeper. He was pointing to something that most of us overlook, that birth is not an isolated event of happiness, but the very beginning of change, loss, aging, and death. To be born is to enter a world where nothing stays the same, where even joy is fleeting. The paradox is this: birth is both beautiful and burdensome. It opens the door to love, but also to loss. It's not that life is bad, it's that it's impermanent. The Buddhist statement is not a condemnation of life, but an invitation to see it clearly, not through the lens of fear or denial, but through the clarity of wisdom. And from that clarity, something transformative begins. Chapter 1. Why birth is considered suffering in Buddhism. To understand why the Buddha called birth a form of suffering, we must first understand what he meant by the word dukkha. It's a term often flattened in translation, reduced to pain or misery, but its meaning is far more subtle. Dukkha points to the underlying unease that threads through all conditioned life. It's the quiet instability behind every joy, the knowing that all we cling to will eventually slip away. In this light, birth is not simply the entrance into life. It is the opening act of a much longer play, one defined by change, vulnerability, and loss. From the moment we are born, we are vulnerable to conditions beyond our control. The body that enters the world is soft, fragile, dependent. The mind is impressionable, shaped by forces it doesn't yet understand. And the life that unfolds from that moment is filled with both joy and sorrow, neither of which last. The Buddha's insight wasn't that life is only suffering, but that suffering is built into the very fabric of what it means to be alive in this form. What, exactly, comes into being when we are born? According to the Buddha, what arises are the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These components, taken together, create the illusion of a stable self. But they are constantly shifting. Like a river that never holds the same shape twice, our bodies, thoughts, emotions, and identities are always in motion. And yet, we cling. We identify with the body as me, with emotions as mine, with thoughts as truth. We fear change, resist decay, and grasp for permanence in a world that offers none. This clinging, this desperate attempt to stabilize what cannot be stabilized, is the root of our suffering. Birth is the starting point of that entire process. It is the moment we enter into a conditioned existence, built from parts that will fall apart. It is not the birth itself that causes the pain, but what birth inevitably leads to: aging, illness, separation, and death. It is the moment we step into a world where everything is impermanent, and where our deepest mistake is believing otherwise. So when the Buddha says, birth is suffering, he's not trying to scare us. He's not asking us to reject life. He's inviting us to look beneath appearances, to see that behind the joy of arrival lies a truth we must understand if we are to find peace. Because until we see this clearly, we will keep grasping, keep aching, and keep circling the wheel of becoming, never quite knowing why we suffer. But in seeing it, the path begins to unfold. Chapter 2. Karma, Craving, and Ignorance, the Cycle of Becoming. If birth marks the beginning of suffering, a natural question arises. Why does it happen at all? Why are we born into this world of change and loss? Is it by chance, by design, or by something else entirely? According to the Buddha, birth is not random. It is not a roll of cosmic dice. It is the result of causes, and those causes live within us. At the heart of Buddhist understanding is the idea of samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. We have wandered in this cycle for lifetimes beyond counting, pulled along by the momentum of our own thoughts, actions, and desires. Birth is not the beginning, and death is not the end. They are simply doors we pass through, again and again, shaped by forces we rarely see clearly. And those forces are karma, craving, and ignorance. Let's begin with karma. In its simplest form, karma means action. But not just any action, intentional action. Every time we act with intention, whether through body, speech, or mind, we plant a seed. That seed doesn't always sprout right away. It may rest quietly for years, even lifetimes. But under the right conditions, it ripens. And the fruit it bears is our future experience. So when we are born, it is not by accident. It is the flowering of seeds we ourselves once planted. We may not remember those past intentions, but they remember us. But karma alone doesn't keep the wheel of samsara turning. Something else gives those seeds their fuel, craving, or tanha in Pali. This is the deep, often unconscious thirst that drives us, the hunger to have, to hold, to be. We crave pleasure. We crave permanence. We even crave existence itself, to continue, to become, to not disappear. And when we crave, we act, we speak, we chase, we cling. And in those moments of clinging, we reinforce the illusion of a solid self. We tell ourselves, this is me, this is mine, I must have this, or I will suffer. But craving is only a symptom. Beneath it lies the deepest root, ignorance or avijja. This is not stupidity, but a fundamental misperception. It's the inability to see things as they truly are. We fail to see the impermanence of all things. We fail to see that nothing truly belongs to us. We fail to see that what we call as self is just a shifting dance of conditions, not something fixed, but something fabricated. And because we don't see this, we act from confusion. We build lives on sand, expecting stability. We love, but we attach. We live, but we fear death. We seek, but we never truly arrive. This trio, karma, craving, and ignorance, works like a hidden engine. It keeps the cycle spinning, life after life. And birth is the natural result of this turning. It is the visible tip of an iceberg that stretches far below the surface. But here's the hopeful truth. What is caused can also be uncaused. What is conditioned can be transformed. The Buddha did not teach these principles to make us feel trapped. He taught them so we could see clearly, and in seeing clearly, begin to undo the very mechanisms that keep us bound. When we become mindful of our intentions, we change our karma. When we examine our cravings instead of obeying them, we weaken their hold. And when we cultivate wisdom, the deep insight into the nature of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, we begin to uproot ignorance itself. So yes, birth is the beginning of suffering, but it is also the beginning of choice. To live blindly, or to wake up, to continue the cycle, or to take the first step toward freedom. The wheel turns only as long as we push it. But when we see what's turning it, and why, we can begin to let go. Chapter 3. Echoes of Suffering in Philosophy, Psychology, and Science. The truths the Buddha uncovered were not meant only for monasteries or ancient forests. They speak to the human condition itself, and as such, they quietly echo across disciplines, cultures, and centuries. Even those who have never studied Buddhism have glimpsed the same insights. We find them mirrored, sometimes faintly, sometimes directly, in the voices of philosophers, psychologists, and scientists who sought to understand what it means to be alive. Take, for example, the field of existential philosophy. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger reflected deeply on the strange condition of simply being here. They described human life as a kind of thrownness. We find ourselves existing without having chosen to do so. No one asks to be born. We awaken in a world already in motion, already full of uncertainty, already demanding answers to questions we didn't know we had. This sense of disorientation, of being thrust into life without control, carries with it what existentialists call anxiety. Not anxiety in the modern medical sense, but something more primal. An unease that arises simply from the fact that we must make choices, bear consequences, and eventually face death, all without knowing why we were placed here in the first place. Buddhism calls this unease dukkha, and it points out that this discomfort isn't an error in the system, it is the system. Suffering isn't a glitch. It's embedded in the fabric of conditioned existence. Now turn to psychology and we find a different lens, one that looks inward, into the mind's construction and emotional imprinting. Developmental psychology tells us that even the earliest moments of life are not free from struggle. The passage from womb to world is often described as a trauma, a violent separation from warmth, rhythm, and unity into a reality of light, noise, and disconnection. Studies in attachment theory further suggest that if our early environment is not safe or attuned, we carry emotional wounds that can shape our entire relational life. We long for security, for belonging, for constancy, and when those are threatened or lost, we suffer deeply. Here again, Buddhism aligns but goes further. It says, yes, attachment is necessary in childhood, but clinging at any stage of life leads to suffering. Not because relationships are bad, but because everything changes. To cling to people, to feelings, to roles or identities, is to hold tightly to a river that never stops moving. What hurts us most is not that people change or leave or die. It's that we thought they never would. Then there is science, with its methodical gaze and cool observation. In the sterile clarity of biology, we see that life is fragile from the start. A newborn cannot survive alone. Its body is soft, its immune system underdeveloped. It relies completely on others for warmth, nourishment, and protection. Even into adulthood, our bodies remain vulnerable to disease, to injury, to the slow erosion of time. Our very cells are programmed for decay. DNA replicates with imperfection. Organs wear down. No matter how advanced our medicine becomes, the body remains a temporary vehicle. Beautiful, yes, but fleeting. In this way, modern science validates the ancient intuition of impermanence. What we are, physically and mentally, is a complex pattern of processes, none of which are permanent, and none of which we ultimately control. Philosophy names our existential disquiet. Psychology maps our internal longing. Science reveals our biological fragility. And Buddhism weaves these threads into a singular insight, that suffering is not just emotional or intellectual, but existential. It begins with birth and follows every form that is conditioned by causes. But the Buddha did not stop at pointing to suffering. Unlike many systems of thought, which describe the condition but offer no cure, Buddhism provides a path. It tells us that the causes of suffering can be seen, understood, and ultimately let go. By recognizing that other disciplines glimpse these same truths, though through different windows, we come to see that the Buddha's teachings are not foreign or far away. They are universal, and they are timely. Perhaps that is why they endure. Chapter 4, From Recognition to Transformation, Walking the Path. Once we begin to see the nature of birth clearly, not only as a joyful beginning, but also as the start of suffering, a quiet shift happens inside us. It's not a collapse into despair. It's a softening of illusion. There is great strength in honest seeing. The Buddha never intended his teaching of suffering to frighten us or to make us feel hopeless. Quite the opposite. He taught suffering because it is the only doorway to freedom. We cannot transform what we refuse to look at. And so, Buddhism begins not with fantasy, but with reality. This is the first noble truth, that dukkha, dissatisfaction, pain, unease, is woven into life. Not because life is broken, but because we misunderstand its nature. We seek permanence in the impermanent. We demand comfort from what is inherently unstable. We want things to last, and they don't. But after that truth comes another, the second noble truth, that suffering has a cause. It is not random. It arises from craving, from clinging, from ignorance. These roots are not outside of us. They live in the mind, in the way we relate to what arises. And that's where the power lies, because if suffering has a cause, then it can also have an end. This is the third noble truth, that the end of suffering is possible. And how do we reach it? Through the fourth noble truth, the path. The Noble Eightfold Path is not a mystical set of rules. It is a practical, compassionate way of living, a roadmap that leads the mind from confusion to clarity, from restlessness to peace. Let's look gently at its 8 folds. 1. Right view, seeing the world as it truly is, impermanent, interdependent, not self. It's not about adopting a belief, but about refining perception. 2. Right intention, cultivating thoughts rooted in renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. Letting go of grasping and replacing it with care. 3. Right speech, speaking truthfully and kindly. Avoiding gossip, harshness, and words that divide. 4. Right action, acting ethically, with respect for life, relationships, and integrity. 5. Right livelihood, earning a living in a way that does not harm others. Living with awareness of the impact of our work. 6. Right effort, choosing what we nurture in the mind, letting go of what harms, and cultivating what heals. 7. Right mindfulness, learning to dwell in the present moment with clarity, observing body, feelings, mind, and reality without attachment. 8. Right concentration, deepening mental stillness through meditation, training the mind to stay, to see, to know. Together, these 8 aspects form a path not of escape, but of transformation. Buddhism doesn't ask us to run away from suffering. It teaches us to turn toward it, with steadiness, with curiosity, with compassion. In doing so, we begin to see that suffering is not our enemy. It is a teacher, a mirror, a guide. Every moment of discomfort can become a moment of insight. Every experience of clinging, a chance to soften. Every breath, a step on the path. And what happens when we walk this path, sincerely and with patience? We begin to let go, not of life itself, but of the illusions we've carried through it. The illusion that anything is mine. The illusion that we are separate. The illusion that lasting happiness can be found in things that don't last. Letting go is not a loss. It is a liberation. Slowly, the suffering that once overwhelmed us becomes something else. It becomes workable, then it becomes manageable, and eventually, it becomes silent. The pain of life doesn't disappear overnight, but our relationship to it changes. We no longer fear it. We no longer define ourselves by it. We no longer pass it on to others. This is how birth, though it begins in vulnerability, leads us toward awakening. Because this human life, though fragile, holds everything we need to wake up. Not in some distant heaven, not after death, but right here, right now. And the first step on that journey is the simplest and hardest of all, to see things as they really are. Chapter 5. Birth as the rare chance for freedom. If we accept that birth is the starting point of suffering, then it's easy to fall into despair. To look at life as a burden, something we didn't choose, something we must simply endure. But that isn't the Buddha's message. His teaching isn't a call to resignation. It's an invitation to awaken. Because birth, while it opens the door to suffering, also opens the only door to liberation. In Buddhist cosmology, among the countless realms of existence, from the blissful heavens to the agonizing hells, the human realm is considered the most precious. Not because it's the most pleasant, not because it lasts the longest, but because it holds the perfect balance. In the human condition, we suffer, but not so much that we're completely overwhelmed. And we experience joy, but not so much that we become complacent. It is here, in this balance, that the seed of insight can take root. You are not a god, lost in distraction. You are not an animal, driven only by instinct. You are a human being, with a mind that can reflect, question, observe, and choose. You can see your suffering, and in seeing it, you can respond with wisdom. That is what makes this life so rare and so valuable. The Buddha often spoke of how unlikely it is to be born human. He compared it to a blind sea turtle rising once every 100 years, and by chance placing its head through a wooden yoke floating in the vast ocean. That is the rarity of this birth. And yet, here you are. This body, fragile as it is the very vessel through which awakening becomes possible. This mind, restless as it is, can be trained. This life, fleeting as it is, can be transformed. The truth is, you need to be in the game of life in order to transcend it. You need a body to meditate, a mind to reflect, a heart to open. Without birth, there is no chance for freedom. So yes, birth is suffering, because it begins a process of decay, attachment, and loss. But it is also a precious opportunity, because it gives us everything we need to break the cycle. Think of it this way. Life is not a trap, but a terrain, a landscape of joy and pain, beauty and impermanence. And on this path, we are not alone. Every being you meet is walking the same ground. They, too, were born. They, too, will suffer. They, too, are searching. And when you begin to walk this path, not just with awareness, but with compassion, something changes. Your suffering becomes a bridge, not a wall. You begin to understand others not just intellectually, but with your whole being. You hurt less because you cling less. You love more because you fear less. And slowly, step by step, you begin to wake up. Not in the dramatic sense, not with fireworks or visions, but in the quiet moments, when you see a craving arise and you let it go. When you feel anger boiling and you meet it with breath. When you hold someone's pain without needing to fix it. When you stop chasing happiness and start cultivating peace. These small awakenings are not small at all. They are the unfolding of something profound. This is what the Buddha meant when he said that freedom is possible, not because the world will stop changing, not because we will stop being born, but because our minds can become clear, our hearts can become still, and our lives can become reflections of understanding. So if you've ever wondered why you were born, perhaps the answer is this: to wake up, to love wisely, to live gently, to walk the path with open eyes and an open heart. Birth is not the end of the story, it is the beginning. Not just of suffering, but of liberation. Not just of longing, but of insight. Not just of survival, but of awakening. This life is yours for now. Use it well.